With any one of these choices, if you find the end result is too much for you, then you can always lower the opacity of the layer to lessen the effect. So I go to the top of my layers panel where I find the word opacity, and in order to change the opacity setting, there are two ways that I usually change it. The first is if I'm in the Move tool, the number keys on my keyboard will change the opacity. If I press 5, I get 50%. Press 3, I get 30%. Or if you press two numbers quickly, you can get a two-digit number in there, like 55 for 55 or 75 for 75. And if you type 0, it goes back to 100. So if you want to change the opacity, you have to be in the Move tool in order to be able to use the number keys on your keyboard to change it. The other way that I change the opacity is I click on the word opacity at the top of my layers panel, click on it, and then just drag to the left or the right to change it. And oftentimes what I'll end up doing is I'll click on the word opacity, I'll drag way to the left till it goes to 0, and then I'll just stare at my picture and I'll slowly bring it up, and I can always shift to the left to bring it down and just try to figure out exactly what I think will be the best amount. And therefore I don't have to think about a number, I'm just dragging back and forth until I visually see what I like. But you're not limited to the blending modes that are in this general section. They're just the ones that are the most universally usable for textures, meaning that if you have a texture, most likely one of those will make it look good. The others will give you a lot more unpredictable end results. But let me show you how you could experiment with them without having to manually go to this menu every time you wanted to try something different. As long as I have the texture layer active, and I also have the Move tool active, I can do the following to cycle through the entire blending modes menu. And what it is I hold down the Shift key, and then I press the plus or the minus keys on my keyboard. If I hit the plus key, I'm going to go down in my layers in that menu, and if I hit the plus or the minus key, I'll go the other direction. I'll go up in the menu. So I can just do Shift and then plus, Shift, plus, Shift, plus, Shift, plus, and keep going to see if one of the other modes might create something interesting. But you'll find in going through that, you get all sorts of weird looking results, and it's only once you get around to that section that starts with a choice called Overlay does it start looking like just a texture applied to your image. But on occasion, one of the others will give you a great looking end result. But if you got less time to play, start in this section that starts with Overlay. Now, we have to be careful with our textures. If we end up starting with a texture that is overly bright or overly dark, then if you remember how those blending modes work, do you remember how I said 50% gray goes away, but anything brighter than 50% gray brightens your image, anything darker will darken your image? Well, if you end up starting out with a texture that's overly dark, that means this is going to darken our image quite a bit if it's darker than 50% gray to begin with. So most of the time when I'm going to apply a texture, before I start applying it, I'll think about adjusting the texture to get it so it's close to 50% gray to begin with. One way of doing that is to go to the Image menu, choose Adjustments, and choose Levels. In Levels with a texture, you will often end up with a very basic looking histogram, which is what this area is called. And if you notice that part of the histogram gets really tall and has a pretty well-defined hump in it, where it is at its tallest point, that's usually the base brightness of that texture. And the way it works is if you find that hump and just go straight down below it and look at the bar that's below that has those shades of gray in it, it means that most of that texture is about this bright. Because the way that bar chart works is it's simply telling you which of these brightness levels are contained within this image. If there's a bar in the bar chart above one of these brightness levels, then it's found in there. If there's not, it's nowhere to be found. So if you look at this particular histogram, I can tell there's no black in the image at all. Because you see there's nothing in the histogram over there, and that's directly above the blacks. And then the height of these lines indicate how prevalent those shades are, just how common they are in the picture. So the really tall part means these are the most common shades. Well, here's what's cool about it. This little middle slider forces areas to 50% brightness. And if you just take that slider and put it in the center of the hump, you've just made whatever's the most common shade in your picture 50% in brightness, like equivalent to 50% gray. And therefore, whatever's most common in that particular texture is going to disappear in overlay or soft light mode, and it's only those areas that are a little brighter or darker that's going to be bringing the texture in. And so if I ended up with a texture that I just captured with my camera, I'm going to open it in levels, and I'm just going to move this slider until it's in the middle of the hump that's there, and then it'll usually be relatively good for using those blending modes. So if you look at images, simple images, images that have this kind of an area where there's not really much detail in it, those can handle really subtle textures where you can barely even tell there's a texture in the texture file. They can still control it. Things like this need a more aggressive texture because there's already enough texture in here that if you add a really subtle one, you're not going to notice it's in there. So that one that we have of the rusty metal, you could see it on this kind of picture, but if you put it on this kind of picture, it's going to be too aggressive. It's going to overtake the picture where it's more about texture than it is about the picture. Whereas if you applied it to this kind of thing, you might need something as contrasty and aggressive as the rusty stuff. With this, the sky can accept really simple, very subtle textures. They'll easily show up where the sky is. But everywhere else, it's going to be a little harder to see that. So you have to decide where do you really want that texture to be noticed. And if you only needed it in the sky, then a subtle texture like the one we started with that was like that painted wall, that'd work fine for the sky. But for the bottom of this photo, we'd need something more aggressive if we need it. Does that make sense as far as just competing with how much we have?